Pierre Poilievre, the MP who's running for the leadership of the Canadian Conservative Party, was in Calgary a few days ago holding a rally. About 5,000 people showed up. And he made some rather grandiose promises about oil and gas development, including he wants pipelines everywhere, north, south, east, and west. And I'm going to talk to Professor Duane Bratt at political science at Mount Royal University about the role that oil and gas plays in that sort of conservative populism that Poilievre represents these days. So welcome to the interview, Duane.
Hey, Markham.
So what are we going to make of this? Is this the standard? Candidates are out looking for memberships and votes, and they just say anything that the crowd want to hear, or is this something different?
This is something different. This is deeply embedded in Pierre Poilievre's psyche, and it is a fundamental aspect of his campaign. So if you think back to the 2019 election, that Trudeau beat Andrew Scheer, one of the reasons he beat Scheer was the lack of a real climate plan. I'm not just saying that. The Conservative Party, in their analysis after the 2019 election, said that. Erin O'Toole read that report, tried to moderate that party on climate, brought in a very complicated, convoluted replacement of the carbon tax, but it was designed to take climate off the table. Poilievre isn't going that route, and he's not even going the Scheer route. He is making this front and center. Repeal the carbon tax, build LNG, build pipelines everywhere, as he said, repeal Bill C-69, repeal Bill C-48. I mean, it is absolutely energy red meat for the base of support. That isn't the sole explanation for the large crowds he's been getting in the prairies, but it sure doesn't help. And so if you thought that Scheer didn't have a real plan, Poilievre doesn't even pretend about having a plan. What I did find interesting is he was talking about the importances of the provinces, and the provinces should be able to decide what is best for them, not the federal government. Well, he knows better. He knows that the federal backstop is only if the provinces do nothing. The provincial government can have any sort of program that they want to reduce emissions. But if they don't, as Alberta chose not to, as Saskatchewan chose not to, as Ontario got rid of its plan, then the federal government stepped up. He even seems to ignore the Supreme Court, which said that this was in federal jurisdiction. So, this will draw him great support amongst the Conservative base. Let's see what happens come a general election.
Okay, so I understand why he would do this in Calgary and in the prairie provinces. That's going to be very popular. But you get out on the West Coast, you get into Ontario, into Quebec, and any place outside of the prairies, that pro oil and gas message doesn't really sell as well. So when he goes and holds his rallies in Prince George or some other place, in Ontario, isn't he going to come back and bite him at some point? Isn't he pay a price for such an extreme message?
Not during the leadership race, because the people showing up in the leadership race are Conservatives, and he has the same message. I mean, give Poilievre credit here. He's giving the same message no matter whether he is in the country. The difference is how he tailors it. So he links the carbon tax to inflation, what he has successfully coined just inflation. And so he says that the carbon tax is the real driver behind inflation. He links the war in Ukraine to Canada's oil and gas policies. And so it's the same message, but it's slightly different in the selling points that he makes across the country. And there is growing awareness about the role of gas. We see that with the Beta Nord approval that the federal government is making. But what Poilievre is saying is well beyond that. I mean, it's really energy policy on steroids, but it's not an energy policy that energy companies actually support, because they have been spending an inordinate amount of time and money trying to find a way of reducing emissions. TC Energy is not about to restart the KXL pipeline. TC Energy is not going to restart the Energy East pipeline, but it's not aimed at those decision makers. It's aimed much lower. It's as you said, a populist message.
Okay, so if it's a populist message, then can we reasonably assume that if he takes that message out to the members, gets himself elected, chosen as the leader of the CPC, then he will. Can we assume that he will not tack back to the center, in 2025 when we have the next general election?
That is going to depend on the sort of mandate that he's got. I mean, Poilievre is when he was in government, because he was a minister in the Harper government, he was pretty much the same guy, right? He was on the hard edge, absolute pit bull, no compromise. I expect to see the same thing here. But if he's in, for example, a minority situation, then that makes it much dicey, because they're the only party that supports these types of measures. Every other party supports greater action on the environment, greater action on climate. So unless the PPC, which, to their view, climate change is a complete hoax, unless the PPC is somehow in Parliament, every other party is going to oppose what he wants to do, which is going to make it very difficult for him to actually implement this message. And that's a traditional problem that populists have. They're very good on the campaign trail. They have simplistic solutions that will solve everything. Think about the billions, tens of billions required to build pipelines. What about the regulatory process? Well, we'll just change Bill C-69. What are you going to do with the courts? Are you going to use the notwithstanding clause dealing with Aboriginal rights? I'm sorry, that doesn't factor into it. So it's one thing to campaign, it's very different to govern.
Now, Duane, when I listen to Poilievre, what I hear in my head is Jason Kenney's voice in 2018 and 2019.
Oh, absolutely. And look at how successful the Kenney approach has been. Now, Kenney would argue it's because of that damn Trudeau and it's damn Ottawa, that if only we had a friendly government in Ottawa, then that would replace all the problems. He would stand up to Joe Biden. He would force Joe Biden to build KXL. He would force the Germans to buy Canadian gas. So yeah, it's very much the same message as what Kenney said. And Kenney was successful in 2018 and 2019 with that campaign promise. He was even able to implement some of that stuff. But then the federal government kicked in. So Poilievre's view is I can give the same message, get the same result that Kenney did in 2018, 2019, but I have more control because I'm Prime Minister of Canada.
Yes, and I want to take you back to 3 or 4 months ago when you and I did an interview about Kenney in the pandemic context. And you said very clearly that in your opinion, Jason Kenney and the UCP were the most incompetent government in the history of Alberta. And so I guess that leads us to a question: are populist governments usually not very good at governing? And what would be the odds that Pierre Poilievre federal government would be much different?
There's been quite a debate when I made that comment about Jason Kenney, because people kept saying, well, what about Bill Aberhart in the 1930s? And look at what he did. Well, what was Aberhart leading in social credit in 1935? Another populist government. Very good campaign strategy, used radio quite effectively, talked about the big shots in Toronto, was going to bring in his own monetary policy, just kind of like Pierre Poilievre, and then got into one trouble after another. And it took Ernest Manning to kind of right the ship and remove some of those populist elements. Same thing, Tommy Douglas was a left-wing populist. But you have to moderate yourself once you're in government, because you're not just representing the people that show up screaming at your rallies. You actually have to represent people who don't vote for you, who vote against you, who don't vote at all. And that's the challenge that the populists have. Donald Trump was a populist, got into a lot of trouble when he governed. So I've got a good friend of mine who often jokes with me saying, that I said, okay, Trump's running, but he's not really going to run. Then he ran. Well, he's not going to win the nomination. And of course, he won the nomination. And well, he'll never win a general election. And of course, he won the general election. But I was absolutely correct on how he would govern. which was absolute incompetence and incoherent. And so we'll have to see. We've never seen sort of that populist element at the federal government level, but we do have provincial examples, and they don't go very well. You have to moderate yourself once you're in office.
Duane, just to close up the interview, I've done some interviews recently with Frank Graves of Ecos Research and David Coletto of Abacus Data, and they're charting the rise of authoritarian populism in Canada, and particularly amongst those people who see themselves, and they're not all conservatives, there are what Coletto calls anxious progressives who are really worried about the economic future, whether they can buy a house, whether or not they can afford to have a family, those sorts of things. How, and Poilievre, I think, by generally is considered to be the face of that authoritarian populism in the federal scene. How worried should Canadians be about the rise of this movement?
I don't know if you need to be afraid of it as opposed to what they represent. I think there are lots of Canadians very concerned about the cost of living. And who has become the face of that has been Pierre Poilievre. He's been able to trigger people and provide a very simple explanation. Why do we have this problem? It's Justin Trudeau. Trudeau is causing global inflation. That's how powerful he is. Why is he doing that? Because of the carbon tax. Why else? Because of all the spending that occurred during COVID. What he doesn't do is start to ask the important questions. So if you were in government during COVID, you wouldn't have had any economic supports? Is that what you're saying? Or to do econ supports, you would have cut spending in other areas? Like, those are much more harder, more difficult questions that you don't have to address on the campaign trail. But what Poilievre is able to do when you trace through all of the packages, right? He doesn't like vaccine mandates. He supported the truckers. His attack on inflation, monetary policy. He is in fact attacking the Canadian dollar, which I've never seen a major Canadian politician ever do before. And his energy policy, there is a link there. And he calls it freedom, but that could also relate to absolute anarchy.
Okay, so let me try to pin you down a little bit more on this, though, Duane. And let's talk about his support for the Freedom Convoy. I mean, that was essentially an attempt to undermine Canadian democratic institutions.
Which he was in favor of because the Liberals were in control of those democratic institutions, right?
Okay,
so there's a partisan element to it.
Fair enough. Okay, so that's I guess maybe the question is those kind of attacks on democratic institutions, make a lot of people nervous right now because they think that if he were prime minister, they would continue.
Let's roll back the clock a bit. Let's look back to when Pierre Poilievre was a cabinet minister. What was his major job at that time was around elections and the changes that he was trying to bring forward to basically tighten up what he called illegal voting and weaken the role of Elections Canada, which has an authoritarian spin to it. Because they were in government at the time. So you wanted to weaken the control of these outside agencies like Elections Canada in monitoring elections, for example. They wanted to make it more difficult for people to vote by bringing in voter ID laws and getting rid of other alternatives to voting. And so I spoke a lot about Poilievre's plan. He had to backtrack on some of that. Some of it got reversed with a change of government. So that's an indication, I think, of where a Poilievre government would go. Is based on when he was in government. And that was a relatively smaller portfolio. That wasn't as prime minister. And that was with Stephen Harper, who did learn you needed to moderate that populist bent to form and to sustain government, because Stephen Harper was not the same when he was in office in 2006, 2008, 2009, as he was when he was in the Reform Party in the 1990s.
Duane, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, you're welcome, Markham.